A very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, good evening, magandang umaga, magandang tanghali at magandang gabi sa inyong lahat, wherever you're located and whatever kind of time zone you are at. This is your hour, and I'm Rita Gadi, welcoming you to what we are going to commemorate today. Just about 3 days before it actually is the day of what we call Araw ng Kagitingan, a day of courage, a day of bravery, a day of honor, of nobility, of audacity, and of fortitude. Many times in the past, when we had coverages of Araw ng Kagitingan, it was usually held at the Mount Samat Memorial, where you had this several hundred feet of a cross rising up into the sky in memory of the battle that was then Bataan and Corregidor. If we go back in time to how this was honored as far as the Second World War is concerned, Bataan and Corregidor. That was where you had the Filipino and the American troops who fought who fought the Japanese. We were controlled and overrun by the Japanese for about 3.5 years at the time. And the last bastion of defense was there at Bataan and Corregidor. And they were there, Filipinos and Americans, the USAFE, as we call it, the United States Armed Forces in the Far East. And they stood there for several months without any reinforcement at all. And so we had it that in December 1941 until May 1942, you had the Japanese Imperial Army that was dropping thousands of bombs on the island itself. And the USAFE, under Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, led his men to finally surrender. And so from January 7th to 1942 until April 9th, that is just a couple of days ago that we're commemorating this day, until April 9, 1942, 76,000 Filipinos and American troops actually were overwhelmed by the Japanese firepower and they had to surrender. So we had the death march from that island all the way up to Capas Tarlac. And in December 1941, we have this surrender. And as I've already said, thousands of bombs were already uh, um, dropped on that island itself. Corregidor Island, and that is the what we now consider as the Pacific War Memorial, the Dome of Peace, if you would want to also call it that. And it is one of the we have the eternal flame there of freedom. And of course, you had the museum of the world's biggest war museum, which is actually part of what happened there in Corregidor and in Bataan. So that was what we are commemorating on April 9th, which is a public holiday. And beyond that, of course, somewhere across the Pacific in Washington, they also have the veterans, Filipino veterans who are still alive, and they're perhaps even their heirs or their children. You have the Bataan Memorial Death March, which they are reenacting there in Washington. So you have there the participation of some 8,631 runners and walkers who were joined in by the 30th Bataan Memorial Death March through the death, whatever it is that they're actually participating in. And this is around the White Sands Missile Range, and this would be usually in commemoration also of the Death March. And as I've said, many of our veterans have already died. Many have migrated to the United States. Many have become American citizens, but that day is still commemorated. And so you also have our OTC cadets in the New Mexico State University, where they initiated this in 1989. And they also had the Memorial March to honor the Filipino and the American soldiers of World War II who were actually forced by the Japanese Imperial Army to march 65 miles without food and shelter all the way from Bataan and Corregidor to Capas Tarlac. And you had thousands who died from the rough treatment and from the maltreatment that were and the execution that also happened, and others died in prison and in the camps. And there you have what the soldiers suffered what they endured in Bataan, it ought to be never forgotten, as they said. And as we also commemorate that, you have survivors there. Many of them actually, 98, 99, and 100 years old. And some of them are still participating in that memorial or in that memorial march. And this is, you have many of these memorials are actually replicated in about 50 states throughout the United States of America and several other countries throughout the world, where you have something like 1,500 volunteers assisted by some of the heirs and some of the children and grandchildren of those who participated in the Second World War. This is still being commemorated, and I'm reading this because this has been part of the crusade and also part of the activities which is um, relayed to us by Bing Cardenas. Resides there in Bing Cardenas Brannigan. She resides in Washington, and she was the one who gave us all this information regarding the Bataan Memorial Death March, which actually is a record crowd every year when they commemorate what we call now the Araw ng Kagitingan. But what is it when we speak of patriotism, of heroism, of the day of honor, of the day of bravery and courage? Is it only in a war that we have to address this and remember it, and that it is only during such a confrontation with the enemies that we have to commemorate such an event? Well, let's go back in time. Perhaps it all began with the local babaylans, the, the Tapar, the Sumaray, the Datus like Bangkao. They wanted to preserve not just their sovereignty, but also their way of life and their faith, whatever it is they believed in, whether it is a pantheistic kind of religion, whether it's animistic, whatever religion they had, whatever beliefs they had at the time, they commemorated this also as their day of honor and of acknowledgement of the bravery and the courage of the men and the women of those primitive tribes that we have. And so we have also the Rajas, the Rahas of Manila and the suburbs of Manila. You have Raja Sulaiman, for instance, who also defended his kingdom. And this was sometime in 1574, already with the Spaniards colonizing our country. So before the Spaniards, led by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, would land in Manila, because Raja Sulaiman learned that Legazpi was coming over to conquer his kingdom along the Pasig River. We know this from legend and from myth and perhaps some excerpts and snippets of history. He burned his kingdom so that the conquering Spaniards would not benefit from all the buildings and whatever else that he has installed in his kingdom along the Pasig River. And these were also the Moros of Sulu. Likewise with the Igorots of the Cordilleras in 1589, and also all the way up to 1620. They were fighting to defend the rice terraces from Spanish invasion, and that was one of the longest revolts actually against Spain, the Cordilleras. The Moros of Sulu also, I mentioned this already, from Maguindanao, from Buayan, Raja Buayan, and they had an ideology that was competitive in character, and it actually became intimately intertwined with patriotism as we know it. So even on this day, on the 9th of April, we commemorate the heroism and the patriotism of this primitive, or what you call ancient tribes. You had, of course, the legendary Sultan Kudarat. And we quote here from what has been written about him. He was patient in defeat, magnanimous in victory, steadfast in faith, and utterly selfless as a ruler. He gained the admiration even from his enemies. He was the paradigm of the warrior saint, and he was such a charismatic leader. That was Sultan Kudarat of Maguindanao and also the island of Mindanao. And then we had other pocket rebellions. And this was even before 1896, when we had the big Philippine Revolution, short-lived as it may be. So more than 100 major revolts, rebellions, riots, and conspiracies. All of this plus hundreds of armed outcries and sporadic uprising, an average of about 5 every day, as a matter of fact, within the 333 years of Spanish colonization. And again, I quote from our notes, rebellions were felt as a need for freedom from the vassalage and its onerous system of tribute collection, freedom from hunger and hardships, freedom from compulsory labor, freedom from all kinds of deceptions and abuses, freedom from the imposition of creeds and beliefs alien to the indigenous cultures, and freedom from any arbitrary and oppressive control. So that was what we quote this from some historical books, as a matter of fact, and that is why we can say that even at the time, before the outbreak of the Philippine Revolution in 1896, you had all of this rebellions already and all of these conspiracies that were actually claiming to have freedom and independence from the Spanish rule. And given the proper occasion for an opportunity and an emergent, courageous leadership, the psychological tension that had been accumulating actually exploded in many ways, not just into the Philippine Revolution, but in several other revolts throughout the country. We had rebellions that were lost because of the defeat, because of the death of their leaders, and because of the betrayal of the men that were supposed to lead the revolution. Again, we could see how often this is replicated in our history. And then there was the Gohoy from Bohol, the longest rebellion so far recorded in our history. And Diego and Gabriela Silang, husband and wife. When Diego was killed, his wife Gabriela led also that revolution. And all of this were actually local rebels, but they were part of what we now commemorate as the Araw ng Kagitingan. It was still the bravery, the courage, the honor, the nobility, the audacity, and the fortitude of these women and men who fought colonial masters and several of our enemies to have the freedom that they were aspiring for all throughout those years of the Spanish colonization. And then we had the propaganda movement, La Solidaridad in 1889, the writings of Jose Rizal and several of those who were writing as the Indios Bravos from Spain and then here too in the Philippines, clamoring for the abolition of every conceivable obstacle to our liberties. And in due time, they also had the people marching with them. And of course, there was the abolition and the taking down of the flag of Spain. But the real success of all of this can be found not in gaining freedoms and reforms, not in arousing that anti-friar feeling, not in obtaining political control, but in the creation of an awareness among the larger and larger groups of Filipinos who's beginning to realize that their own nationality and the sense of nation, which actually is the origin of patriotism, la patria, the earth that is our roots, the earth where we have come from birth, that was what was important. So whatever it is, whether they are, from that time on, this is from Schumacher, actually a Jesuit who was writing this. You had Andres Bonifacio, the first national hero, who also had a clear vision of what our country should be. You had Kalayaan with the all of these other leaders, and they start with all of this. It also starts with what they call mabuting kalooban. Again, it goes back to what we know of the Bushido Code, which has something to do with benevolence, with rectitude, with justice, with courage, with the spirit of caring and of daring and of being able to bear all the difficulties. It was also the sense of benevolence in a way, of politeness, of courtesy. And that was how our early revolutionaries actually were treating themselves and others. They also had that sense of veracity and sincerity and honor, of course, and loyalty. And they had the training and their education towards these ends. And of course, the most important was self-control and discipline. And so we had nationalism also during the time of the Americans. As we quote, the Americans were not always dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. That was very clear and very evident during the American occupation of our country. Nationalism, that was it, that was also brewing at the time. Then you had the Sakdal Revolt of 1930, mainly against, some of our leadership. We had patriots of the heart, poets of the spirit. And so what did we call them? Do we dare to play the game of politics when you had all of these people actually leading a revolt against the incompetence of leaders and against the disloyalty of these leaders to what we call the nation, and that is where patriotism comes from. You had Mariano Sakay, who continued the Katipunan also, and he's giving together with his group. They also had, well, they were called by the Americans as bandidos, parang mga, the a derogatory term. But then you had that group and that label stuck. And so he remains for many as an unsung hero. This is Macario Sakay. And then you also have the guerrilla rebels of the war who won the war for our country despite the lack of training and made the Americans their efforts less costly. And of course, they were also remaining to be unrecognized because it was MacArthur actually who took much of the credit. And then you had the rebels as patriots when independence came in 1946, and they changed to the rebel as a subversive to the flag, and their motivations became to be varied. Actually, you had the claim fighting for one thing, which is actually patriotism, which is love of country. And then you had the communist insurgents from the Hukbalahap movement, which has already deteriorated to what it is today. But at that time, it was also a call for nationalism, a call for the independence of our country from the control of the Japanese, of the Americans, and then expectedly from the control of our own Filipino leaders themselves. You had the Battle of Pinaglabanan, perhaps the only battle that was waged in the metropolitan Manila area, which at the time was not even known as the National Capital Region. But this was the biggest battle of Pinaglabanan. It is a marker that we have here in San Juan City, where you had the young soldiers. Actually, you can't even call them as being trained in soldiery, but they were brave enough to assault and to get into the Pulburin, which was the armory, where the Spaniards kept their cannons and their rifles. That was the Pulburin here in San Juan City, and that was the Battle of Pinaglapanan. Even with their bolos and their bamboo sticks and their clubs, they didn't even have guns or gunpowder or even rifles. But they assaulted the Pulburin just to prove that they could get into the armory of the Spaniards. At the time, this was the Battle of Pinaglabanan. All of this with all the good intentions that they had at the time, the biggest battle actually of the young people, 16, 17, no, even not even older than 18. And as they say, they were even shot at and their heads, they were decapitated, but they still kept on marching. The adrenaline was so high. And the records of this particular Battle of Pinaglabanan is something too that we commemorate on this, the Araw ng Kagitingan, because that showed the bravery of our young people at the time. A question which we now ask today, where are our young people of today? Anyway, so we had also all kinds of movements even after all of this. You had the guerrilla movement, and then you have, of course, several of these adventurists, as you would call it, or those who were leading coup d'etat. You had one of the first there in 1986 with Gregorio Hanasan and Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel Ramos joining in, and several other coup attempts against the Corazon Aquino administration. They were called adventurists. They were called military adventurists, yes, but they also had a cause, which was actually their distraught and their anger that most of them had to be reassigned in Mindanao or in certain areas because they were identified with the previous administration of President Ferdinand E. Marcos, and also because they were fighting for what they believed in from the very start of their rebellion. They reformed the armed forces movement, where you had all kinds of promotions without giving merit to those who actually deserved it, and several other issues against Mrs. Aquino, such as for example, the communists that were liberated. They were already in prison serving their sentences. Jose Maria Sison is a great example of this. And then you have Dante Buscaino and several other communist leaders and communist rebels that were released. And this, of course, caused a lot of anger with the incumbent soldiers and the military personnel. And that is why one coup after the other was occurring at the time. And several of the reforms that they would have wanted to be completed or executed or done, which never really were realized. And so there you had a series of this adventures, so to speak. But then again, you had 8 of them actually, if we go by contemporary history, all of them rebelling against the current administration then of Mrs. Corazon Aquino. And so there, how would we call this? Are they apathetic, or do we sympathize with them? Or do we also celebrate them today as exemplars or examples or models of bravery, of courage, of heroism, or love of country for that matter? And so perhaps we will look at how it is today when we have the enemy known as the COVID-19, a pandemic, an enemy that is invisible but which slaughters our people just indiscriminately. And now with this new variant that has been spreading like wildfire, we have names that are given persons with names and names with friends and all of this that we can recognize and all of this that we know, and it really is getting closer to home. That is the enemy of today. And so we have here the greatest rebellion that we can have against this pandemic. And so we pray that we can be hopeful and that we can be guided with strength likewise and with the courage to defy this invisible pandemic, this invisible virus against all odds in many ways. But then, as I've said, there are many things that we have to consider when we speak of the Araw ng Kagitingan, which we are commemorated on April 9. So here we are with the call for patriots. Patriots coming from the root word patria, which is our land, our nation, our country. A call for patriots becomes necessary now for all time, but even more so now during our present condition. How do we become heroes in our own light as we try to fight this COVID-19 when there is no clear military strategy as far as we are concerned on a day-to-day basis on how to fight the COVID? We are given all kinds of palliatives regarding this. A vaccine is already being given to as many people as possible with certain categories. We have other kinds of medicine that are possible. And then we have all of those herbs and natural medicines, and of course, ginger and calamansi and lemon and all of this that could strengthen our immune system. That is how we are going to fight this. Are we patriots enough to be able to control this spreading epidemic now that it is so necessary, now especially for all times? But even more so, as I've said, because during our present condition, it is the national consciousness that needs it. It is the national demand for a health program that demands it. And our very souls actually cry out for it. And so we have a call for patriots which extends beyond the stories that we read every day, beyond the numbers and the statistics of how many now are the active cases, how many have died, how many have recovered, how many is it that gives us the totality of how this enemy, this COVID-19, is conquering many of our citizens. Beyond these narratives, where is our sense of heroism for this? And beyond the deeds of valor and all the exceptional acts that we may be able to exhibit, where can we go and what can we do to be able to answer this call for patriots? Is it simply a call for patriots in a matter of spirit, in a matter of conscience? Because it lies at the very heart of our life as a Filipino. Not only when we stand to salute the flag or when we sing the national anthem, but it is actually on a day-to-day photographs and images and statements from our health workers, from our relatives, from our friends, from all of those who post how difficult it is to go through this particular virus, this particular pandemic. And so we also have our political leaders. Where are they at this particular stage? Are they also to be considered as patriots at this stage? Do they teach us how to become patriots against this epidemic? A call for patriots is the call of the hour. It is a call not just for bravery, not just for courage. We look at the membership of Congress. We look at the executive departments. We look at all the speakers who stand before us in the podiums, giving us the latest of their press releases, the latest from the Interagency Task Force for emerging infectious diseases. We look at all the different calls that our leaders and our people have, our health workers, our doctors, our scientists, all of this. We have all of these assemblies actually being organized. And then we have the strange but the impending reality of all of these voices that are crying out. And then we ask ourselves, Araw ng Kagitingan, how can we brave this pandemic? The people are the sovereign power of the state. The people elect their representatives as surrogates of their political will. The people expect their elected officials to express their thoughts, their minds, their acts, and they also expect them to present their visions, their dreams, and the people demand that their voices also will be clearly held. Do we hear this from leadership, from those who are above us, from those who should give us the strategy, those that could give us the tactics of how to fight this pandemic? The voice of the people is the call for patriots. It is a call for the high moral ground of ethical statesmanship. It is a call for the execution of ideals, a call for the sacrifices of leadership without conditions, a call for service without hesitation, and a call for total compassion. It is a call for a government that is truly of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. And this is what we demand on this day, Araw ng Kagitingan, on the 9th of April. And so we have the beauty and the wealth of our nation and our natural and human resources. They're contained also in that adage of the call for patriots, is there is nothing more resplendent than what God has given to nature and to humankind. And patriotism is the patrimony we are given from birth till our death. And so therefore we have this call for patriots, which I never tire of repeating. It is a call of our own destiny. But is this the kind of destiny that is facing us today? An illness, a pandemic, a vicious virus, where we have to strengthen not just what we have within us, our spirits, our ideals, and also ourselves. With all the myths and legends that we have, how can we fight this? The courage, the fortitude, the valor that have been handed down to us for generations in so many wars, in so many confrontations in the past. And now especially we need this at this most honorable hour, the fullest actually in the order to preserve the values that we stand for, our own physical health, our own lives for that matter, and above all, a call for character in many ways. And so we have for each and every one of us embedded in our history and in all the glorious past that we have had, and which I have been mentioning over and over again for the commemoration of Araw ng Kagitingan. All of this bears down with the ugliness that is in front of us, this pandemic, this virus. How can we stand bravely against all of this? How can we be honorably standing in front of this virus that we have to fight? By saying, for instance, I am a Filipino, is that sufficient? And then we have to answer also to the honor of that name. And what is the honor of that name, to be a Filipino? And so it is that we have, for instance, the making of the Philippine Revolution in the past. Why does a person become a patriot? Or how does one become a patriot? That which we are celebrating on the 9th of April. A revolution could attract hundreds and thousands, and probably with all different motives. But we have to be united under one common cause. We turn to scholars, to historians, to scientists, to doctors, to our leaders even, and even to politicians, to find one extraordinary element that makes this our cause a unifying factor for which we can actually determine the course of our future. Often it is a personal experience, all of this, and we cry out and say it is so unjust, we don't deserve this. Then we have all of this from history. For instance, Jose Rizal and his companions in the propaganda, they did not lack personal reasons for overturning the colonial order. Neither do we have enough reasons now to overturn this pandemic and make it disappear and stop it from causing so much suffering and so much death. And then we had the heirs of Lacandula, of Sumakwel, of Sulaiman. They were also part of the revolution or the fight against the Spaniards. From them we can learn, of course, the traits of courage. But here is an enemy we do not understand, at least on a day-to-day basis. It is difficult even to capture it when we are facing it with the numbers and the statistics that is being read to us on a daily basis. And then we also had Andres Bonifacio. He did not have any personal suffering on his own against the friars, but he was from Tondo. He was a man of the city, and the city is the place where all of these revolutions begin, when the protests begin. And so here we have the National Capital Region. Here is where we also raise up our voices in protest against this pandemic. Does a revolution intrude into our lives? Isn't this some intellectual process or some kind of an observation outside of us? But when we speak of this virus, for instance, isn't it something that captures our minds, our hearts, and even our very souls when it comes to a period already or a platform of desperation? See how it is that we stand aback and stand a while when we speak of Araw ng Kagitingan, a day where we speak of all the honor and all the glory and all the bravery of the men who fought revolutions and who fought enemies, when today we face this contemporary enemy. We ought to be a united nation. Like Andres Bonifacio said so many times, and many other of the revolutionaries, we have to be united. We have to have the words to unify us. We have to have the words to make our sacrifices together with everyone else. Together we participate with those who are in need of help, to those who are dying. We can transform all of these arguments into a vision if we can only realize how important it is to be united at this stage, so that there could no longer be any barriers between the politicians and between the barangay captain, between those who are leading the sitios, between the demands for livelihood and jobs, and some element of assistance, especially for those who have nothing anymore to eat or to drink on a daily basis. We have, for instance, our noble men in this Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino, who over the past years have dedicated their oath of offices to what is known as the Save the Nation movement. Save the nation. Save the nation from many of the ills and many of the discrepancies and many of the prejudices that surround us. Today, it is also the cry of this Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino to save our nation from the elements of our own constitution, where we can have provisions that can alleviate our plight against what we know now as those who control the basic services for our people and make money on them, which is actually against the services that ought to be given to the greater majority of our people. We have said this often enough, and my contemporaries and my colleagues in the Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino have enunciated this over and over on a daily basis. It is so important now at this stage to realize that water, electricity or power, public transport, and all of the other basic services should now be given back to the people. Let government handle it, so that all the different kinds of management and administration are actually being managed and administered by the people and not by businessmen or oligarchs who make money on these services just for their own benefit. We have said this repeatedly. There is nothing wrong with becoming rich if you want to handle certain kinds of industries. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be in the first 500 lists of all the billionaires of our country. But there is something very wrong if they, the oligarchs and these businessmen, these conglomerates, these corporations, make money which is for the service of the people. That ought to be given back to the people. We understand how in the early months of President Duterte's administration, he already took cognizance of this, speaking of a constitution that will be able to define what is important as far as granting the independence of our different regions, a federal kind of government in the sense that all of these policies and programs can now be decided by the people themselves, a greater amount of economy for the people, so they can now look into the different activities for themselves, by themselves, without having to get approval or without having to go through all of this begging kind of stance with the members of Congress and other people from the central government. All of this can now be federated to different regions. Remember how it was. President Marcos early on divided our country into several regions. I think we now have originally 15, now we have 18 different regions. Each region is composed of several provinces. And during his time, President Marcos has already instructed all the economic managers and all the economic experts and all of the finance managers of the National Economic Development Authority to look into all of these regions, to undergo a careful study on the data of each of these provinces that comprise a region to find out if it could stand by its own and be automatically autonomous from the central government. He had them make a database for the natural resources that these provinces have, the number of forests and the number of trees in these forests, the number of waterfalls and sources of hydroelectric energy, the number of the kind and type of soil that can be planted to the kind and type of products, the natural resources which are in the mountains, which could also be unearthed for the benefit of the provinces and the region itself, plus all the different demographic profiles of the people there, whether they can work together with the rest of the communities of the provinces, also for food production, and what could be the greater impetus for growth and progression. All of this were actually written down already before our regions were divided. And that was the seed of a federal form of government where autonomy could be given to these regions so that each region can survive by itself on its own without having to be depending on asking favors from the politicians, from Congress, from senators, and also from the central government. Of course, there were exceptions like the National Treasury, Foreign Affairs, National Security, and several others which only the central government could be able to administer and execute. But all the rest of all the different methods and strategies for working out the autonomy of every region to be more progressive, that was already written down. And sadly, it was not continued, and now we are going back to it. And we understand that early on, President Duterte already had this in mind, but has kept quiet on it now and has been overwhelmed now with the pandemic that is actually facing us. But we still have 700 days before the end of his regime, and we are praying and hoping and also crying out that there could be certain provisions that could be able to be executed without having to have major changes in our constitution, and that perhaps a constitution also could be written that will be able to answer both the strategies and the tactics and all the necessary progressive effects of this pandemic as we move on into the future. And so we have here from Biak na Bato, as we speak of Araw ng Kagitingan, all the way to Pugadlawin, to the tearing of the cedulas just to remove our indulgence and our subservience to a foreign country. So too must we tear all of these agreements with the oligarchs so that it could be brought back, the services could be brought back to our people. Then you had, of course, I mentioned already Pinaglabanan and the murder of Bonifacio and his brother in the mountains of Maragondon. See how it is that history repeats itself and how it happens that there is such envy, there is such greed, there is such enmity among us. Now is the time, Araw ng Kagitingan, for us to be realizing all the different moral and ethical codes that are so important, originally written already in our earlier laws, in the Kalantiaw and the Maragtas, which was actually more of an ethical and moral code, not only for the discipline of our people, but also a code of conscience and a code of character. That perhaps is what we have to realize and what we have to go back to every time we speak of Araw ng Kagitingan. It is not enough that we recall all the bravery and the heroism and the valor of all of those who fought in so many revolutions and the wars of the Second World War and those who have joined other wars in other countries. But it is the war that we have today, which is actually a war among ourselves. How we are able to confront the evil within us, how we are able to kill the enemy that actually surfaces within us. That perhaps is the greater value of the Araw ng Kagitingan, which are commemorating on the 9th of April. And so it is that we celebrate this day, the 9th of April, and also our Independence Day on the 12th of June, for all the reasons that we can possibly think of, that we can establish, and now especially for the independence from this pandemic that we really ought to commemorate on the 9th of April, which is just a couple of days from now. So what is the meaning of patriotism, of this love of country, of this love for our native soil? That is exactly what the call for patriots is all about. As Andres Bonifacio has said, and I quote, Is there any love that is nobler, purer, and more sublime than the love of our native country? And so we celebrate Araw ng Kagitingan, our honor, our valor, our courage, our strength, our fortitude from the reckoning date of 113 years ago when our flag was first raised above our country and hoisted with the national anthem wafting in the winds. And then shortly thereafter, we already had a 3-century-old enslavement. And then, of course, several others that came thereafter, together with the granting of independence by the United States of America, which we consider as the Philippine-American Friendship Day. But what is this friendship now at this particular stage? When you have, for instance, the threat of what is happening in the South China Sea. There have been photographs and images of 200 military vessels from the People's Republic of China parading itself out there over territories which are supposedly our exclusive economic zone. So what is it that is confronting us out there? If not there, then perhaps also within our country. When you have the People's Republic of China with its military vessels 185,000 miles away from our island, from Palawan, for instance, where it is actually inhabitable. That is why the Chinese are trying to pack it up with enough earth and soil so that they could be able to stand on it. But that's about 185 miles, nautical miles away from our nearest island in Palawan. But here, within our country, you have the United States of America actually residing and living in 5 Philippine bases. For whatever reason that were written down in this enhanced defense and cooperation agreement, we have no idea exactly why we are being defended in these 5 bases where the Americans are located. For what? Against China. But the invasion of China is not inside our country. The invasion of China is out there, 185 miles out. I'm not trying to defend those military vessels, but let us balance this with the presence also of another foreign power within our own Philippine bases. Is anyone actually asking questions about this? What are they doing here? Well, as they say, it helps us for humanitarian reasons in case there are natural disasters. I pause. Perhaps it would be best if you could ask and answer those questions. Nonetheless, we have to balance the presence of military hardware and military personnel, not only out there in the high seas of 185,000 nautical miles, but here within our country, within our Philippine bases of another foreign power, which has been actually our ally, our friend, our big brother, and for what purposes and for what reasons, we still have to be able to understand. Now that we're having this pandemic and we see how the discrimination against the release of vaccines coming from the United States of America, from all of these Western countries, from all of the rich countries of the world, how trickles are really just being sent to us for our own use and for our own people. Again, here we have to underline the fact that if this is Brother America, what then is it doing to be able to help us for this pandemic? If it is the big brother that has colonized us for 45 years, if actually there is this EDCA, which is to help us with humanitarian reasons, now is the time sa Araw ng Kagitingan that we have to cry out. Help us with the vaccines that is so badly needed, with the testing, with all of these laboratories that will have to assist our people so that we can be able to have a better kind of national health strategy and program so that we do not have to confront this virus in such a manner that we are just simply left alone. So what began, as I've said, with our babaylans in the ancient times, Tapar, Sumangkay, and the Datus, Bangkao, and all of this, we go back now to all of this, all of these times that we have today, as we speak of the confrontation and the kind of strategy that we have to employ when we speak of the war against this virus. We are still crying out for this. We are still asking that we be assisted because it is not sufficient whatever it is that is being given to us. And so, as you've said, well, the first donations came from the People's Republic of China. Were there any donations coming from any American pharmaceutical firms, from any European allies of the American democratic system that have been provided us? Questions too. We speak of Araw ng Kagitingan. So what kind of a bravery and honor are we commemorating today? As it was when we had 86,000 Filipinos and Americans in defense of our country at that time, because our soldiers were not reinforced and we had to surrender. For what? For an enemy which was not our enemy. Japan was an enemy of the United States of America. It first bombed Pearl Harbor, simultaneous with the bombing of the American bases and the Americans here in our country. And that was where we were just left to fend for ourselves. For what? For 3.5 years under Japanese occupation, until MacArthur comes bravely landing in Leyte after the biggest naval battle, saying, I have returned. I have come to liberate the country after we have suffered already 3.5 years of this Japanese occupation. Be that as it may, should we be grateful then for the granting of independence from the Americans? And should we also be, as we said, also saluting ourselves because of the courage and the dignity and the nobility that we stood for love of country? We salute the soldiers too, the soldiers that are cast upon the character of our race. The courage of the soldiers, his loyalty, his valor, all of this which are indelibly printed in the histories of the women and men who served under different commands of the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, the Marines, the Special Forces, the Intelligence Corps. They serve for the security of our nation, and it is to them that we offer, in many instances, that we could see how our salute goes because of the honor of them giving up their lives. Because that is the definition of what heroism is all about. When a person adheres to a cause that is greater than himself. And we find them in many instances. We find them likewise, those in the health assistance, in the intensive care units of hospitals, in the doctors that continue to serve, all of those that are already in the most difficult and the most serious stages of this COVID. They are the people we salute today in the Araw ng Kagitingan. They hold firmly the truths and the honor of their profession, and to each calling of their lives to a cause really greater themselves. And for each and every one of them, whether on duty or off duty, or whether they are there 24 hours or 7 days a week, beyond the call of service, beyond the threat of death, they are the people that we also salute and acknowledge and honor sa Araw ng Kagitingan on the 9th of April. Because there can be no greater deed than that which challenges destiny to be within the range of one's control. And these are the health workers that daily, on a 24/7 timeline, challenge destiny itself. And that is how, on the 9th of April, we also acknowledge them with great honor, because they too stand for the bravery, the courage, the nobility, and the loyalty to their profession to save hundreds, thousands of lives because of this pandemic. And so it is that as we close our program, A Call for Patriots is a call for everyone, for each and every one of us, in our own homes, within our families, within our friends, within our relatives, within the professions that we are actually undertaking, within the unemployment that we're presently suffering. All of this, in whatever battleground it is, we each must face in the daily ordinary course of our regular lives, in the corridors of power, in the enclaves of wealth, in the hovels and street corners, in the fields, the forests, and the open seas. The call for patriots is to deserve with honor and with pride that we are actually patriots from this land, the Philippines. I am a Filipino. So this is the Araw ng Kagitingan, which we commemorate on the 9th of April. Before I close my program, I always miss reciting this prayer. Dear God, walk with us through this season of the pandemic. Open our hearts to your wisdom. And Lord, give us the strength to share your love with others. Through this time of uncertainty, may we look at each day as a celebration of your greatness, O Lord, and make us always ready to share your mercy, your love, and your compassion with everyone. Thank you, Lord, for guiding us. Amen. Okay, so then let me go over our chat. Where do I go from here? Chat. Let's see all of those who've joined us. Watching from Cainta, Rizal. Shout out po yung mama ko na nasa Makati. Binabantayan po yung lola ko. Yes. Si Elaora. Yes, we are going to have prayers also for those who are watching, all of those who are sick. Hello po, Ma'am Rita. Ingat po kayo lagi. Yes, I'm still on home-based work. So not leaving the house is really very important. Viola Mia, for afternoon po, watching you from home, from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Thank you po at napakagandang programa nyo. Napakaganda rin kayong lahat. Reggie Avenido, good afternoon po, madam. Good afternoon to you. Sentinel Store watching. Yes, for all of those all over the world who are watching us, sending your messages, and also those who are also sending me requests for assistance. You must try to understand that it is difficult to just simply write to people at this stage. It is also difficult to just email your problems to offices. There is such a thing as demanding already what we need. And so perhaps what we could do is, again, through social networking, we can post the needs and the requirements and the services that we need, because government has an open ear, has two open ears for this, and then they do come to assist all of those in need, or at best, together with your congressman in your district, your mayors, and all the other local officials, if this cannot be taken care of by ourselves individually. A difficult time for all of us, but still a call for patriots and a call for heroes at this particular stage. I'd like to thank you. Oh, before I close, I'd like to offer my sincerest condolences and sympathies to the family of Judge Maluruñez, our sister in the sorority and my classmate in the Sambeda College of Law, and a dear friend. Our condolences to her daughter, her only daughter, and her loved ones, and of course, our continuing prayers for the eternal repose of her soul. You know, this is how difficult it is at this particular stage. And also for the family and loved ones of Mayor Antonio Sanchez. His burial is tomorrow. A good friend, and also at many times in his life as a politician, a patriot in many ways. And so with all of this, I'd like to thank you for having joined us. This is Rita Gadi, and this has been your hour.